It was the year 1565, deep within the heart of the Ottoman Empire's golden age. Istanbul shimmered like a living jewel, its domes catching the sunrise over the Bosphorus, its minarets piercing the clouds with pride. But while the empire's armies thundered across continents, conquering cities and bending kings to their will, another kind of conquest was unfolding in silence, one hidden behind marble walls, perfumed halls, and latticed gold screens. Inside Topkapi Palace, where the Sultan ruled both with the sword and the bedchamber, hundreds of women lived not as queens but as captives of desire. The world knew the place as the Imperial Harem, a word whispered with fascination and fear, half fantasy, half nightmare. But what truly happened there was something far darker than any court poet dared describe. The air inside those forbidden chambers never knew stillness. Night brought not rest, but preparation. The smell of rosewater, musk, and amber oil filled the corridors, so thick it clung to the skin like invisible chains. Eunuchs, tall, silent, expressionless, moved through the shadows with eyes that saw everything and mouths that spoke nothing. Their footsteps echoed softly across cold marble, carrying secrets that no man or woman beyond those walls would ever hear. In one corner, a trembling girl was being bathed in milk and perfumed oils. In another, a concubine wept as she braided her hair, knowing tonight she might be chosen or forgotten forever. Every breath in the harem carried weight. The flutter of a silk sleeve could spark jealousy. A whispered word could mean death. Those who smiled too brightly were accused of pride. Those who wept too long of weakness. Even beauty could be dangerous here. For each woman was a piece in an invisible game of power, a game played not with armies, but with glances, whispers, and the illusion of love. The Sultan's choice could raise one girl to unimaginable luxury, or erase her existence entirely. So when the golden doors of the harem closed and the torches flickered low, the empire's greatest secret came alive, a secret written not in ink or blood, but in silence. Before we step deeper into this perfumed prison of power, lust, and fear, subscribe now, because what waits beyond this door are rituals so strange, so forbidden, that even history itself tried to bury them. The Sultan's harem was said to be paradise on earth, but every paradise, when unmasked, has its hell. To understand the world of the harem, you must first understand the empire that built it. The Ottoman Empire of the 16th century was not just a kingdom, it was a living machine of conquest, ritual, and divine order. Stretching from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, it ruled over tens of millions of souls, binding them beneath a single crescent moon. At its heart stood Istanbul, once Constantinople, a city where the air itself seemed soaked in power. The call to prayer echoed over marble courtyards, and the domes of mosques glittered in the morning sun like the armor of angels. But beyond the beauty and the prayer, the empire was obsessed with one unspoken fear: succession. The Sultan, believed to be God's shadow on earth, could rule over armies and oceans, yet his throne depended on something fragile, intimate, and unpredictable: the womb of a woman. In that single truth lay the seed of the harem's creation. The imperial harem was not a place of spontaneous pleasure, it was a structure of absolute control, built with the same precision as a fortress. Every wall, every ritual, every breath served a purpose. Its women were not wives in the Western sense, but instruments of dynastic strategy. The Sultan could have hundreds of concubines, yet only a few would ever see his face. The rest existed in waiting, polished and perfected like treasures locked in a vault. Their beauty was catalogued, their bloodlines recorded, their behavior monitored. Within this world, rank was everything. The lowest were the odalisques, the attendants, young girls newly brought in from distant provinces, often sold or gifted as part of tribute to the Sultan. Above them were the gurzde, the favorites, whose faces or charms had caught the eye of higher officials. Above them, the Iqbal women who had shared the Sultan's bed and survived the night. At the top stood the Kadın Efendi, the official consorts, and reigning above all, the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. The Valid Sultan ruled the harem with the same authority her son wielded over the empire. Every gesture she made could alter destinies. If the sultan was the flame, the valid was the hand that controlled the oil. She decided which concubines were educated, who would be trained in music or poetry, who would be presented to her son, and who would vanish into obscurity. Beneath her watchful gaze, the harem was transformed into a school of obedience disguised as luxury. The girls were taught Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They learned calligraphy, embroidery, the playing of the oud, and the art of conversation. But beneath those refined lessons, a darker curriculum thrived. How to move, how to breathe, how to please without speaking, how to conceal fear behind a smile. Desire was weaponized, femininity forged into political currency. And watching over all of it were the eunuchs. Those who had been mutilated to serve without temptation. Most were taken as boys from Africa, castrated in desert outposts before being sold to the palace. Their suffering was the price of their authority. It was they who patrolled the halls, guarded the gates, carried messages, and maintained the machinery of silence. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kaisler Isa, stood at the threshold between the world of men and women, serving as both servant and warden, spy and priest. He alone could enter both the harem and the sultan's private chambers. In his ledgers, each concubine's name was recorded, each gift noted, each punishment observed. It was through his ink that history was remembered, or erased. To the outside world, the harem was the jewel of the empire, the envy of Europe. Ambassadors and travelers wrote tales of golden baths, of women adorned in pearls and silk, reclining on cushions of velvet, serenaded by music and laughter. But these were illusions crafted for diplomacy. Within, the truth was suffocating. The palace walls were thick enough to muffle screams, its courtyards were wide enough to swallow names. Once a girl entered, she ceased to exist to her family. Letters were forbidden, her past erased. Even her name was changed. She would be given a new one by the valid or the sultan himself, a name chosen for its beauty, not its memory. She was no longer a person, but a reflection of the empire's perfection. In this controlled chaos of silk and fear, love could not survive. Affection was dangerous because it implied choice, and choice was a luxury no woman possessed. Rivalries bloomed in silence. Jealousy was poison disguised as perfume. One smile too many could provoke suspicion. One whisper too long could spark punishment. And yet, despite the fear, ambition thrived. Some women learned how to use the system to their advantage, rising from concubine to consort, from servant to queen. Their weapon was their grace, their shield, their cunning. But each ascent came at a cost: betrayal, humiliation, or exile. For every woman who rose, 10 others vanished into the palace's dark record books. This was the paradox of the harem, an empire within an empire, built on beauty, but ruled by terror. It existed not merely to indulge the sultan's pleasure, but to ensure his lineage, to manufacture heirs like commodities, and to keep power contained in feminine form. Every kiss was strategy, every touch, a transaction. In these corridors, women learned that submission could be survival, and desire could be disguise. And yet, even in this gilded machinery, rumors persisted. Whispers of rituals that went beyond training or obedience, practices so secret that even the eunuchs avoided their mention. Some said these rites were ancient, carried from the East long before the Ottomans rose. Others claimed they were the Sultan's personal inventions, desires turned into laws. Whatever their origin, one truth remained: the deeper you descended into the harem, the stranger the rules became. The lessons of etiquette and elegance were only the surface. Beneath them pulsed something darker, something sacred and obscene, born of lust, superstition, and fear. And so, as the empire expanded beyond its borders, its greatest secret remained hidden in plain sight, beneath the domes of Topkapi, behind the jeweled screens of the harem, where power and pleasure were one and the same. But what the world did not see were the rituals that bound these women to the sultan, not by choice, but by ritual, by magic, by cruelty disguised as devotion. Because what awaited behind those doors was not merely seduction, it was indoctrination. And as we enter that next chamber, the line between paradise and punishment begins to blur beyond recognition. Inside the golden labyrinth of the Topkapi Palace, time did not move as it did in the outside world. It stretched and coiled, looping endlessly between desire and dread. For the women who lived within its scented corridors, days bled into nights and nights into rituals that blurred the line between pleasure and torment. The harem was not chaos, it was choreography. Every movement, every glance, every breath was rehearsed under the gaze of those who had survived long enough to teach the next generation how to endure. The eunuchs enforced order like priests of an unholy religion, and the women adorned, educated, and imprisoned became the offerings upon its altar. What began as beauty was refined into obedience, and obedience, in time, became submission so complete that even thought itself felt like rebellion. The training began the moment a girl entered. She would be stripped, washed, renamed, and reclothed in the garments of her new existence. The first lesson was silence. Words were dangerous, questions forbidden. She learned to communicate with her eyes, to smile on command, to cry without sound. Her body became her only language, and her worth would be measured in how well she could use it. They taught her how to walk slowly, as though the air itself resisted her, how to lower her gaze in reverence without appearing weak, how to dance not for joy, but for judgment. Music filled the chambers, soft and haunting, played by other concubines whose fingers trembled on strings as they watched their futures disappear. They practiced for hours, until exhaustion blurred the line between pain and perfection. If she faltered, she would be beaten, not with whips, but with humiliation. Her hair might be cut, her jewelry taken, her meals reduced. These were the subtle punishments of a system that understood that physical wounds heal too quickly. Shame, they believed, lasts longer. And then there were the nights of selection, when whispers rippled through the corridors like a fever. The Sultan had sent word he would choose. It was called halvet, the sacred seclusion, when one girl would be summoned from the ranks to share his chamber. The chosen would be bathed by eunuchs in water, infused with rose petals and sandalwood, her skin anointed with amber oil, her lips stained with pomegranate. Her attendants would shave her body, comb her hair until it glistened, and wrap her in silks so delicate they seemed woven from light. Yet beneath all that beauty was terror so sharp it made breathing painful. For if she failed to please the Sultan, if she hesitated, if she spoke without permission, if her eyes met his too boldly, she might never be seen again. Those who succeeded were rewarded with jewels, rooms of their own, and the possibility of bearing a royal child. Those who did not vanished quietly. The palace spoke of them as if they had never existed. What few outside ever understood was that the Sultan's chamber was not a place of intimacy, it was theater. Every gesture, every sigh, every act of touch was ritualized. The Sultan was believed to embody divine virility, and so each encounter became a reflection of his power. Priests whispered prayers before the union, astrologers chose the hour according to the movement of the stars, and perfumes were chosen to correspond with celestial alignments. It was said that when the Sultan lay with a woman, he did not see her as flesh, but as a symbol of the empire itself. His desire was not human. It was cosmic, a reenactment of creation, with the harem as his universe. Yet beneath these grand illusions lay something far more human and horrific, a man devouring souls to sustain his sense of divinity. The women, stripped of name and will, became the canvas on which his power was painted. But not every night ended in pleasure, for in a place built on competition, jealousy was inevitable. The harem was a nest of rivalries, each concubine dreaming of becoming the mother of the next sultan. A single pregnancy could change everything: status, wealth, even survival. Those who failed to conceive were slowly pushed aside, first in affection, then in visibility. The corridors were lined with shadows of the forgotten women who once held the Sultan's gaze but were now invisible, their beauty fading like perfume at dawn. Some were sent to the old palace, a euphemism for exile. Others met quieter fates. Rumors told of silken sacks, of bodies slipped into the Bosphorus at night, of eunuchs returning at dawn with damp footprints and empty eyes. Death came not with swords but with ceremony, suffocation disguised as mercy. The Ottomans believed spilling royal blood brought misfortune, so strangulation became the method of choice. Even in execution, elegance was maintained. Among the most feared punishments was drowning in the royal cistern. Those condemned would be led down torchlit corridors beneath the palace, where the air smelled of stone and stagnant water. There, beneath the splendor of Topkapi, a pool awaited. Dark, silent, endless. A eunuch would whisper the condemned's new name, the one she would take into oblivion, before lowering her into the water. No screams, no violence, only the soft splash of silk meeting its final silence. The next morning her belongings would be removed, her name erased from every record, her memory swallowed by the same empire that once worshipped her beauty. There were other rituals, too, those whispered about but never confirmed. Some said the Sultan, believing in omens and magic, ordered certain women to perform strange acts meant to ensure his potency. They were made to drink aphrodisiac potions, brewed from crushed pearls, saffron, and the blood of doves. Others were forced to fast for days, bathed in incense smoke, then presented as offerings of renewal. It was said that in the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, known later as Ibrahim the Mad, these rites became grotesque spectacles. Obsessed with scent and flesh, he would perfume his concubines from head to toe, then release them into pools of milk and honey, declaring them flowers of paradise. But his paradise rotted quickly. In one infamous night of madness, he ordered his concubines to line up along the palace terrace, their jeweled anklets catching moonlight as he laughed and threw some into the waters below, claiming the sea was jealous of their beauty. By dawn, 40 bodies floated in silence, their perfume mingling with the salt air, a massacre wrapped in poetry. The eunuchs buried the dead before sunrise. No prayers were spoken, no names recorded. The Sultan feasted that night as if nothing had happened. And yet, the empire whispered of that night for centuries, calling it the wedding of the sea. They said even the waves wept, for the women had died not from defiance, but from devotion, believing until the last moment that beauty might save them. In truth, it never did. Still, not all horror came from the Sultan himself. Within the harem, cruelty often flowed downward. The Valid Sultan, in her pursuit of stability, enforced rules that turned women against one another. Informants thrived. Betrayal became a form of survival. Those who refused to participate were isolated. There were stories of favorites being locked for months in perfumed chambers, rooms filled with cushions, mirrors, and food, but no human contact, until their minds fractured under the weight of silence. Some clawed at the walls, others whispered to invisible attendants. It was said that the eunuchs would listen at the door and report the words of the mad, for even insanity, in this place, could be used to predict rebellion. The harem's true horror was not its physical torment, but its psychological perfection. Every cruelty was wrapped in beauty. The floors gleamed, the fountains murmured, the air was sweet, but the women inside learned to hear what the fountains were really saying. Behind the sound of flowing water was the hum of despair, the echo of footsteps that would never leave those halls. To the outside world, it was paradise. To those within, it was purgatory painted in gold. And still, the world beyond the palace gates envied it, fantasized about it, called it romantic. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was how desire itself was turned into punishment. For the women were taught that their only path to power lay in pleasing a man who viewed them not as people, but as possessions. They competed to be noticed, knowing that to win his gaze was to lose themselves. They were forced to smile while dying inside, to seduce while mourning, to become the very instruments of their own erasure. It was a kind of spiritual suffocation that no blade could equal. And so, the machinery turned endlessly. New girls arrived from foreign lands, trembling and wide-eyed, unaware of what awaited them. Old faces disappeared, their rooms reassigned, their names forgotten. Eunuchs kept the ledgers, the Valid enforced the rules, and the Sultan played God in a world that existed solely to feed his divinity. Centuries later, historians would argue about the truth of these stories, debating whether the most bizarre rituals were myth or memory. But the walls of Topkapi remember, even if the archives do not. In the polished marble and the darkened pools, in the faint scent of amber that still lingers in its halls, the empire's secret still breathes, a testament to how beauty and brutality can coexist so perfectly that they become indistinguishable. Because the Ottoman Harem was not merely a house of pleasure. It was a system of control, a labyrinth designed to turn love into obedience, individuality into ornament, and the human soul into decoration. And as the centuries passed, the machine only became more intricate, its rituals more perverse, its silences more absolute. But if the harem was a reflection of the empire itself, then its next chapter, the climax of its corruption, would reveal something far darker than lust or power. It would expose how an empire that once ruled half the known world was devoured not by its enemies, but by its own obsessions. By the 17th century, the Ottoman harem had evolved into something more than a palace within a palace. It had become a shadow empire of its own, an invisible kingdom ruled by whispers, rituals, and the will of those who understood that true control did not come from armies or laws, but from the human heart's ability to be molded, broken, and remade. The harem was no longer simply a private space of pleasure. It was a mechanism through which the entire empire was stabilized and corrupted at once. Every secret kept behind its jeweled walls rippled outward, shaping the politics, the wars, and the very destiny of sultans themselves. In these years, the harem ceased to be merely an instrument of desire. It became the empire's soul, and that soul was devoured by fear. The machinery of cruelty had by now become formalized, its rituals recorded not in poetry or rumor, but in ledgers and decrees. Every birth, every death, every punishment was logged by the chief black eunuch, whose handwriting became the silent scripture of the empire's inner sins. Behind the facade of incense and devotion, the harem functioned with the precision of a bureaucracy. The women were categorized by beauty, temperament, and fertility, their roles defined down to the smallest detail. The sultan's intimate encounters were scheduled like council meetings, determined by astrologers and dream interpreters who claimed to read fate in the patterns of smoke. There were lists of perfumes to be used on certain nights, formulas of oils to heighten arousal, and even specific verses of the Quran to be recited before union. What outsiders imagined as unrestrained pleasure was in fact a kind of religious theater where power dressed itself in the garments of sanctity. The sultan was not indulging himself, he was performing empire. At the center of this spectacle stood the Valid Sultan, whose influence could crown or destroy any woman in a single word. Many Valides, such as Khurram Sultan and Turhan Sultan, came to wield authority greater than viziers and generals. They decided not only who would enter the sultan's chamber, but who would live to see another dawn. Some ordered executions with the calm of administrators signing reports. To them, mercy was chaos, order demanded blood. The harem thus became a mirror of the empire's politics, a labyrinth of alliances and betrayals, of secret factions and silent wars fought not with blades but with smiles. The Valid Sultan's chambers, though draped in silk and perfumed with jasmine, were in truth the empire's darkest war room. Under such a system, motherhood became a weapon. Every concubine who bore a son instantly transformed into a political player, for each infant prince was a potential ruler and a potential corpse. Ottoman succession law decreed that only one heir could inherit the throne, and to secure that succession, fratricide was not only permitted but expected. When a new sultan ascended, his brothers, often still children, were strangled with silken cords in the dead of night. The mothers of those boys screamed into pillows, knowing that their sons' deaths were the price of stability. Imagine the horror of those women, one day bathing their infants in milk and rosewater, the next day watching eunuchs carry them away with soft steps and blank faces. These killings were not acts of madness, but of policy, performed beneath gold ceilings painted with verses about mercy. The harem thus became both cradle and graveyard, where the same womb that gave life was made to sanctify death. This is where the Ottomans' greatest paradox emerged. The empire that ruled through divine law institutionalized sin to preserve order. The Sultan, believed to be God's shadow on earth, lived surrounded by acts that blurred the line between holiness and blasphemy. Ritual purifications before and after intercourse were said to cleanse the body, but no water could cleanse the mind of what it had seen. Some rulers began to lose themselves in these contradictions. Sultan Ibrahim, driven by paranoia and lust, drowned in his obsessions. He ordered the construction of chambers filled with mirrors so he could watch himself from every angle as he lay with his concubines, convinced that in his reflection he could see signs of divine favor. When his favorite odalisque fell out of grace, he had her sewn into a sack lined with silk and cast into the sea. The eunuchs recorded it as a disposal for disobedience, nothing more. In that phrase, so bureaucratic, so cold, lay the true horror of the Ottoman harem. Cruelty had become paperwork. By the late 17th century, the system began to devour itself. The sons raised within these perfumed prisons grew into men who understood nothing of the world beyond their walls. Born among whispers and guarded by eunuchs, they inherited not courage but paranoia. They saw enemies everywhere, even in their mothers, even in their beds. Some refused to meet their ministers face to face, communicating through curtains. Others became recluses who collected concubines as trophies, but no longer knew what to do with them. The harem, once designed to breed heirs, had instead bred fear. It was said that the scent of rosewater, once a symbol of love, became for some sultans the smell of dread, reminding them of mothers who wept in silence and of brothers who never awoke. Yet for all its rot, the system continued to glitter outwardly. Foreign ambassadors still wrote in awe of its splendor, describing the women's beauty, the fountains that sang, the music that floated through moonlit courtyards. They saw the marble and the gold, but not the ghosts. They called it paradise, because they did not know what paradise costs. Behind every curtain was a story erased, behind every jewel a life spent in silence. Even the eunuchs, those keepers of secrets, were haunted. Some grew old within those walls, their loyalty rewarded with rooms and pensions, but their dreams tormented by the things they could not forget. In their sleep, they heard the splash of water, the faint rustle of silk, the echo of prayers never answered. The empire's philosophers wrote that a system built on desire must eventually consume itself, and so it did. The harem became both the heart and the poison of the Ottoman dynasty, a place where human life was refined into spectacle. The line between power and madness vanished. Sultan Murad IV, obsessed with moral purity, banned wine, coffee, and tobacco throughout the empire, yet his own nights were spent in orgies of punishment and devotion, alternating between prayer and violence. He would kneel before dawn to beg forgiveness for sins he planned to repeat at dusk. His concubines learned to read his moods, not from his words, but from the rhythm of his footsteps, the way his shadow moved beneath the candlelight. Every sound became an omen. Was it the tread of affection or of death? By the turn of the 18th century, the harem's silken walls could no longer conceal its decay. Corruption had seeped into every corner, yet its rituals persisted, embalmed in tradition like relics of a dying god. Those who had built the empire through faith and sword had left behind heirs who ruled through fear and flesh. And so the Ottoman harem stood, magnificent and monstrous, the most beautiful prison ever conceived, an empire within an empire, governed by superstition, vanity, and the slow erosion of mercy. And yet, even as it rotted from within, the world still gazed upon it with wonder. Pain, when wrapped in gold, is easy to mistake. When the empire began to wither in the 19th century, the harem too began to fade, its rituals slowly losing meaning as the outside world modernized. The palaces still stood, gleaming in the sun above the Bosphorus, but within their marble walls the air grew quieter, heavier. Western diplomats came and went, their reports filled with curiosity and exotic fantasies, never realizing that the world they described was already dying. The eunuchs grew old, their ranks dwindling, the Valid Sultan's influence slipped away, and the concubines, once trained for a life of ritualized desire, found themselves obsolete in a world now governed by laws, not superstition. The Ottoman dynasty began to reform, to mimic Europe, to speak of progress and science. But within the harem, progress meant extinction. One by one, its rituals ceased. The pools that once reflected torchlight were drained, the perfumed corridors darkened, and the women who had once been the empire's silent power faded into anonymity, their names forgotten, their stories left unspoken. But the ghosts of that world did not die. They lingered in the scent of rosewater that still clung to the palace walls, in the records written by trembling eunuch hands, in the rumors that still echo through Istanbul's old quarters. Some of those women, freed at last when the empire collapsed, wandered into the new republic like sleepwalkers awakened from a dream too long. They carried the memory of silken chains, of beauty turned into bondage, of love that was never truly love. They had lived lives so ornate, and so controlled that freedom itself felt like a wound. The modern city around them moved on, but they did not belong to it. They were relics of an empire that had devoured them, witnesses to the truth that beneath every golden civilization lies a dark architecture of control. Even now, historians argue whether the most disturbing tales of the harem were exaggerated, distorted by European fantasy, or buried by Ottoman pride. But the truth, stripped of rumor and ornament, remains undeniable. The harem was a masterpiece of human contradiction, an institution that elevated beauty yet annihilated identity, that promised paradise yet delivered servitude, that worshipped women as divine and treated them as disposable. It was not merely a place, it was a mirror of empire itself. The same hands that built mosques and libraries, that wrote poetry and law, also constructed a system where power could disguise cruelty as refinement. That paradox is what made the Ottoman harem not a myth, but a warning. The lattice screens that once hid its secrets now gather dust, but when the wind moves through Topkapi's abandoned halls, it still sounds like whispers, soft, resigned, eternal. The world outside may have forgotten the names of those who lived and died within, but their silence remains, heavy and unbroken, pressing against the memory of marble and gold. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the harem, not its splendor, not its scandal, but its silence. The silence of countless women who were trained to be perfect, who were forbidden to speak, and who were still waiting to be heard. So, as we leave behind the perfumed darkness of those chambers and step into the light of modern history, remember this: every civilization, no matter how enlightened it calls itself, hides its cruelty behind beauty, its power behind ritual, its domination behind love. The Ottoman harem was not an anomaly. It was a mirror held up to humanity. Tell me, now that you have seen what glimmered behind the lattice, which of these truths haunts you most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to uncover more forbidden chronicles from the shadows of our past, because history, when stripped of its glory, always bleeds.